Welcome to the Revive Ministries Podcast. June is Post Traumatic Stress Awareness Month. There's about 12 million people in the United States who suffer from PTSD, but an alarming amount of people don't seek out help. So today we're going to discuss it. We got a new guest. Her name is Dr. Joan Samuel-Daniels, correct?
Dr. Joan Samuels-Dennis.
Dennis. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's
All right.
okay.
Thank you for so much for joining us, sharing your insight, and just being part of the discussion. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. It's good to be with you.
I want to share a disclaimer for those who are in the United States. 988 is a suicide crisis lifeline. But I always say I don't like reinventing the wheel. What works for you, find what resources, whether it's a church, whether it's a pastor, whether it's a friend. Seek help if you need help. The three hardest words to say is, I need help. So
Yes.
I encourage you to do that. I always start off with a quote just to spark the conversation, Dr. Jones. So it's from an unknown writer. It says, it's not about what's wrong with you. It's about what's happened to you. What comes to mind when you hear this quote?
Yeah. We've all had, for the person who's 40 and thereabouts, we've all had three significant moments that have happened in our lives. And our bodies will define that as traumatic, even if our mind doesn't. And so it is absolutely about what has happened, because there's an interpretation that often goes along with what has happened that then leads to forms of imbalances, I would say, because there are so many imbalances that we need to look at with trauma. So there are physical imbalances, there are the emotional imbalances, which then lead to mental imbalances. And those are all linked back to the beliefs that we have about what has happened.
And also, I want to ask you, a lot of times when we think about trauma, we kind of just, we bunch it all together. I just wanted to share as we begin this month, as we pay tribute, as we remember the people who are suffering, our families, our friends.
Yeah.
We can give a little insight regarding the types. If you want to add the types of trauma there is to those listeners.
Yeah, and the way that I usually speak to audiences and even my clients about this is I tend not to focus on the type, because from the type we then go to severity or to extremes, and it really does come down to the interpretation about an event. So typically what I tend to do is I focus on kind of that bodily response, and then I focus on the mental response, which has to do with our beliefs, our thoughts, the emotions that are connected there. And then there's a spiritual response, which moves us from a place of being able to love I say openly and, with the open embrace versus fearing. So typically there's this body, mind, spirit response, and it's more the response that matters, because the response occurs because you feel afraid or terrorized, or you feel like you're being unfairly and unjustly and extremely punished in some way, shape, or form. And there's a sense of overwhelm that often comes with that. So you can see that in very severe cases, you can be at war, you can be in a battle, you can see someone die, and you have that response. And then there can also be something of what we would consider very simple, and yet there is still the response. So, for very young babies who are traumatized, sometimes it's as simple as having fallen or being dropped or whatever the case may be, but that trauma will stay and the body will remember that trauma for a very long time. So what I tend to say is, as long as the response looks like overwhelm and terror and shock and fear, then we've got a traumatic moment. But in terms of the ones that we might typically think of, and what the diagnostic and statistical manual will think of is where there's a threat. So your life is threatened or someone else's life is threatened and you bear witness to that.
Mm.
There's often that sense of my life or somebody else's life can be over. That's kind of how severe they go when they diagnose PTSD.
Yeah, no, I just love how you kind of last month. Well, we're in still in May, but I like the individualizing it because a lot of times it won't like we don't make sense. Last month, I remember the theme I put for May was simply put, remembering our names.
Yeah.
Remembering our names.
Yeah.
It's very personal. A lot of times, mental health is messy. So I love how you brought it down. A lot of times, sometimes, and the statistics is that a lot of people don't get help when it comes to trauma.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it is what you just mentioned, the idea that, oh, I'm not as bad as this person.
Yeah.
I don't need to get the help because I wasn't in combat. I wasn't in this kind of scenario, but it's more about the responses, which I love. Me working in the mental health field also, I kind of realized that it's really it's client centered. It's a person. You
right.
individualize the care that matches the individual and their culturally context and all that. So I feel that's very, very important. I really appreciate you sharing that.
We tend to compete even in ways that we don't need to compete.
Yeah.
So oftentimes, even though a person is suffering, really what they're saying when they say, I'm not as bad as the other person, it makes the ego feel a little bit better about the circumstance, but you still need help, right?
Yeah.
So what I tend to do is I tend to take away the competition by saying you've had your own experience. And so you and I don't actually need to compare our experiences to one another, other than I want to be able to have compassion for you. So because I've experienced my own and I know how challenging it was to heal, I then want to make sure that you have the space to express what it is that you have experienced in your life, rather than filtering that through something that says I have to look at another person before I look at myself.
I feel that's very true. A lot of times, that's sometimes the difference between a healthy support group versus a not.
Right.
And I say this because being a facilitator for NAMI as a support group, I just remember just when it becomes a competition of who had it worse. It doesn't really bode healing. You may feel like that little short term, like, okay, I'm not alone, but what's beyond that?
Yes.
And also to give, obviously, I want to not minimize, especially myself being in the military. Also, before my brother being in the military, family being in the military. Just one quote I just want to share. Kind of really speaks volumes. It's from Jake Wood. It says, I feel no emotional connection to these outward human gestures. I am not there because I never left Afghanistan. And for me, it just, being, serving during that time period, during 9/11 and stuff, you kind of remember just a lot of times, just shifting your proximity or where you're at doesn't change where you're are inside. So I really found this quote very deep. What do you find when you hear this quote?
It's such a powerful way of describing separation, right? And that's what I call it. Because what happens in these traumatic experiences, especially if it's so jarring and startling, is one part of you stays present and observes what's happening, and the other part of you absolutely disappears because that's the only way you're going to cope with this, right? And so there's this desire to reconnect, but until you move through the healing journey, that reconnection doesn't happen, and some of the memories that need to come back doesn't actually, come until that healing happens. So I love, I feel no emotional connection to these outwardly human gestures. I'd like to know what the human gestures are.
Yeah.
It makes me ask the question, what is the human gesture? Is it kindness? Is it, the caring? What is it that feels so disconnecting? And that absolute sense of, there's a part of me that has been left behind, and that now it piques my interest in terms of saying, okay, so how do you bring that part of you home? Because there has to be a process for bringing that part of you home.
Yeah, and you mentioned the gestures. I just wonder a lot of times, sometimes I get clients who are saving the world, not themselves. And you're wondering if these gestures, not minimizing Jake Wood's comments, but is it saying yes to every family event? This
Right,
is saying is it saying yes to everything
right,
that
right.
people? I'm like, oh yeah, he's great. He's so helpful. He's
Yeah,
wonderful, and this is how he feels. This is the That's why I was thinking about the what um, at first I had a different theme, but I changed the theme to a silent healing because I feel a lot of times it's silent.
yeah, it
You're by
is.
yourself. So when you think you work in the field and you deal with a lot of people struggling and
Yeah,
maybe even your own
yeah.
circles, what have you experienced that you've seen help those suffering? Like obviously there's different ways and you go in if you're individual, but what maybe more importantly, what has not helped you? What has not helped the people who are really struggling with trauma that you've seen from your
Yeah,
experience?
I think what has not helped is a whole lot of talking.
Yeah.
And we tend to do that. And what has not helped is talking, but never talking about it, right?
Mm,
So a lot of us, we're talking about this thing that bothers us, and we focus on whatever is in this present moment. This bothers me, or whatever it is bothers me. But if the healing happens when you can relate what is happening right now to an earlier moment in time that actually traumatized us. Now, there are some moments in the present that have traumatized us. And so talking about it there and then is helpful. The
mm,
other thing that we need to know is that sometimes we talk about it and it prepares us for healing, but talking is not necessarily what's going to heal us. So it's important for us to engage in talking, because each time we talk, we dive deeper and deeper. But if you only talk, if you never actually look at it, then that is not helpful. So then the other part that I have found most helpful is when there can be a process where you begin with talking, but then you immerse yourself in the experience in a way that is safe and guided. So
mm,
you have to go back into the memory, but you're never going to go back into the memory as yourself. You're going to go back into the memory as yourself in the present moment, observing something that has happened in the past. That is the safest way to go into a memory. And it is the ultimate way that you have compassion for yourself. So you're outsider viewing yourself experiencing something that is so taxing or intense or fearful, and now, because you're looking at yourself experiencing that, you can say, oh my god, that was so horrible, right?
mm,
Or just like you would look at another person and say, I am so sorry that you had to experience that, you can now look at yourself and say that very thing as well. And the compassion for self is the healing power, right? So
mm,
until you have compassion for self, you don't come out of it. And you then, if you look at it as yourself in that moment, you don't see the things that you need to see. Whereas when you go back and you're an observer in that moment, you can look at it and see things you would never have remembered beforehand. So those two are possibly the most helpful. And then just talking without actually diving in is least helpful.
I see. I mean, we could get stuck in like the understanding of it, be right at the, and then there's no movement. One thing I was thinking about was the blind men uh, discovering an elephant. The whole thing. Everyone's touching one part of the elephant, and like, no, it's a snake, and no, it's all the. And I found this interesting because they're all correct, but they're all
Yes,
not.
yes,
Yeah,
right, right. And,
So
and that's the way to think about the healing journey is that you are going to meet certain techniques
mhm,
at times when you need them. And
mhm,
it's not that they're not good techniques. It's just this is what you're ready for right now. But
mhm.
when you're ready for the fullness of it, then you will be able to see the elephant, the blindness goes away, and you're able to, just engage in a different way.
Yeah, and just to also pay tribute, I remember I was looking for obviously some quotes that kind of, and also some one of the most notable times that people experienced trauma was during World War II, during the
Yes,
Holocaust, and
yes,
Corey Ten Boom, she wrote the book. It's called The Hiding Place. But one
yes,
thing she wrote, one of the quotes in the book, it says, "The man, face, and body told the story more eloquently than his words.
yeah.
Pain haunted eyes, shaking hands
That
that
cannot
cannot forget."
forget.
It's kind of, I love the descriptive
Yes,
qualities of this excerpt of the book, and she was, just to give context for those listening, she was smuggling Jews during the
yeah,
war, and we have notable people who did exceptional things during that time, and it's inspiring. But there's also and one thing, secondary trauma kind of thing. You kind of
yes,
witness it. You're
yes,
helping these people, but you're hearing these stories, the
yes.
stories, stories, stories,
And
and if
teaching,
you're not careful,
yes, yes,
yes. So.
absolutely. Yeah, this was another powerful quote.
Mhm,
And as I, as you visualize it, you're almost seeing the pain
mhm,
in the eyes. And so as I think about the body and the way that the body would, curve itself or bend itself, especially when it's in pain, and then the shaking and the continuation of the fear and the terror in a moment, right? That
mhm.
that our bodies remember. And if nothing else tells the story, our body tells the story. One of the things that in my practice I do is I use the body to assess the moments in time that we need to actually process in order to move past our traumas. So I use a technique called applied kinesiology. And I will use the eyes and match it with the strength of the arm or the legs or whatever part of the muscles can be tested as strong or weak. And then I will find the moment in time by just looking at the month, the day, the year. And then once we isolate that moment, I can say to you, well, on July 15th of, 1983, something happened. So can you describe for me what happened? And so the person will describe it. And as they describe it, we will then move into a forgiveness journey together, where we're forgiving whoever, did the wrong, and then forgiving ourselves as well. And sometimes the forgiveness is just about ourselves. But you will see the person's face transform as we move through the forgiveness process and the releasing of those tensions that are hidden in that moment in time. You'll see them stand up like straighter, sit up straighter.
Mhm.
Um, you'll see a glow come over their face, like it's almost like a presence of peace has come over them. And that's always pretty phenomenal to notice and experience as well.
It's interesting how much forgiveness, I can play
Yeah.
a big part in the healing. The reframing, the
Yes.
understanding.
Yes.
Um, I just know, just looking back at some experiences, we are hard critics on ourselves. A lot of times when you're in the teens, something traumatic happens, and maybe someone gets hurt, maybe someone overdoses, just kind
Yes.
of
Yes.
generalizes, and you're hard on yourself. I should have picked up the phone. I should have. And you don't look at yourself on the third. You don't look at yourself to say you're like 17, 16 years old. You haven't been trained to deal with substance use. You didn't answer the phone, and then you kind of allow yourself to
Yes.
process that. And I feel the forgiveness part is huge because that kind of dives into your self image.
Yes.
If you hate yourself, the one thing I always laugh is like, obviously people want, some people want to better their health, but a lot of times I ask the why question.
Yes.
Why? Oh, I want to look better. No, why? Because like a lot of times we can make excuses for everything. Because if I don't like myself,
Yeah.
if I really detest myself, I might be able to go to the gym, work out for a while until something
Yes.
happens. Because at the end of the day, if I hate myself, why would I want to better myself?
Right.
That was saying it's kind of
Yes.
it's weird to think that way, but in the concepts of experience and how forgiveness, this came to mind when you were sharing all that.
Yes. You're absolutely right. We're our biggest critics, and oftentimes we say other people are criticizing us,
Mhm.
but we're the ones who are criticizing us. And you'll say other people are harsh, but we're the ones who are not gentle towards ourselves, right? And so if we're constantly experiencing the criticism, the judgment, the hatred, there's something for us to shift internally. And that's usually associated with some of our most traumatic moments.
Mhm.
And so if we go back and we forgive, especially in a conscious way, where we look at the entirety, the elephant is what I call conscious awareness.
Yeah.
The other parts is kind of like a partial awareness, but not conscious, right? And so we have to then step into the place where the forgiveness becomes conscious. We're able to see the other person and then see ourselves almost mirroring exactly what they have done to us, right?
Mm-hmm. And I just want to pause a moment. With my new guest, I'd like to give them an opportunity to share it a little bit. If you'd like to share a little bit about yourself, what brought you into the field? Like a lot of times, it's not very. A lot of times it takes a unique individual. It's not always easy. So, and why do you think it matters today when we talk about trauma? If you want to share whatever you feel comfortable.
Yeah. So I would say that my love for, and I do love mental health, my love for mental health, I discovered probably in 2001, thereabouts. And at that time, I was working with single mothers on social assistance. All of them were chronically ill, experiencing mental health challenges. And as I interviewed them one after another and another and another, I discovered that they had some pretty severe childhood traumas that they had endured, whether that was physical, emotional, sexual, or whatever the case may be. There were these things that they had endured that they didn't know yet how to overcome. And I was there as a helper, as a registered nurse at the time. And here I started to dive in and wanted to help, but realized, oh my goodness, I'm sending these people off to these psychologists and psychotherapists and all of these other things, but they don't seem to be getting any better. I began to ask a question, and the question was, how do we permanently heal these traumatic responses that they had? PTSD, depression, anxiety, personality disorders, you name it, it was there. So I went on to do my master's. I began to look at how income actually impacted on well-being. I went on to do my PhD, and in my PhD, I wanted to discover this intervention. I finished my PhD, and I kind of felt like, oh man, I didn't actually do what I came here to do. And it would be about 4 years later that I would go on my own healing journey. And through that process, I would discover the answer to the question that I'd originally asked, right? So I am now the developer of something called the Becoming Method. It's a forgiveness method that uses the body to kind of isolate. And then I went on to then infuse Christian spirituality into that.
Mm,
From there, I've added certain components that really gets down to the heart of the beliefs that we hold
mm,
that are formed in some of those traumatic moments and the ways in which we absolve ourselves of them. So there's a particular technique called Psyche that is quite popular out there. There's
mm,
another technique that's less popular called the Recode. I use prayer, I use declarations, I use meditation. I
mm,
incorporate all of that into the process. Forgiveness heals, and then after that, there's this transformation that all of us go through when we heal.
mm,
Hence the word becoming. And that's the reason why I do what I do now. So now I've moved from individual therapy to now looking at the Black nation in particular, the traumas that we have endured. I think we're all traumatized, but
mm.
I think because of the enslavement experience and the intergenerational traumas that have transcended, that we are still experiencing some things that we call normal, but it's really PTSD and other types of mental illnesses that we've normalized. So my desire now is to take what I know and bring it to an entire population
Mm.
and help that population do some healing work.
Well, that's wonderful. I think about just you brought up the faith. As a leader in the church, one thing I noticed is the people with the connection of God, how they view God really dictated how they responded and how they handled their faith. And some of the most devastating and destructive forces when it comes to that is basically mirroring how they feel God is seeing them. So I find that very interesting because a lot of times it's not connected that way. But in the church, as you know, it's very complicated.
Yeah.
Someone's good news could be someone's bad news. You have a lot of
Yes.
someone could be on remission for cancer while someone just passed away. If you're not able to connect with a person quickly enough, people leave. And at the same time, sometimes I've seen, and I'm not saying this for every church, but there's a lot of codependency that gets flooded in there and guilt to stay there. So I love the fact that we're trying to use what has been effective, kind of use the idea of forgiveness and understand. And I love all that because a lot of times we kind of think about it as, well, we need to heal. Well, I think part of healing is understanding. We had a mental health symposium where I went last week for this month, and the guy said something very interesting. He said, with diabetes, we don't wait to get diabetes to start working on it. We kind of work on it now. If you work on your health. It's not, if I'm really mentally ill, does that mean I'm not sane? It's kind of that kind of thing. We don't look at medical illnesses the same way as mental health. And I found it, I kind of knew that, but I loved how he illustrated. He did a great job. He was the main speaker. But
that's the perfect way to talk about it, and because trauma has so many different layers of responses, what we tend to do if somebody has a stroke or they have cancer, we tend to be very supportive. We tend to go to the nth degree in order to make sure that they're comfortable, and we surround them and we support them. But if somebody has a mental illness, then for some reason we go to the place of, you should be able to do better. You don't need support. You just need to, basically pull your socks up and, keep going. And I love what he said, because it's like, now we need to talk about trauma. We need to talk about healing as a trajectory and a movement towards health. And for everyone, except in situations where I've had someone who cognitively couldn't process what it was that I was saying, that was the only thing that ever hindered their healing. And I think for some individuals, there's other things that we have to do in order to support them.
Yeah, and also just a lot of times defining what healing is,
Yeah.
defining what better is, depending what independence means. They use all these words, but what does that mean? I just
Yes.
know some of my experience with close friends, and they're like, they may be stagnant, and they're not they just finished college, they're not going anywhere, they're having all these issues.
Yes.
Then they're like, oh, you're still in your parents' house. Like, oh, you need to just get another place. And I remember this person said to me, well, I'll just go somewhere and be miserable somewhere else. You know what I mean? And it's funny to say it that way. It's very kind of
Right.
insightful, but it's kind of true. A lot of times you just think that just leaving an area, maybe for a little bit,
Yes.
depending where it is, but
Yes.
at the same time, I like with this quote again. This new the
Yeah.
mind replays what the heart can't delete, and it kind of really speaks to your forgiveness because I could say I'm gonna forget, but it's gonna, especially if it really hits us hard and
Yes. Yes.
emotionally. I
Yes.
think this has been a great conversation. I also want to ask you, aside from healing, I kind of shared why I thought it was a great theme. Why do you think it's important to remember, in your opinion, why do you think it's important to remember this month when it comes to PTSD Awareness Month?
Yeah, I think, there's been this cool thing that's happened with our calendar now where almost every month we're remembering something.
Hmm.
And I think for those people who have experienced a traumatic moment that now stays with them and triggers them and causes all kinds of visceral responses as well as kind of those silent responses as well, it's so important to pay attention to the silent suffering that can be happening. But it also is the time when we can then speak to what can help these situations. We're always discovering new ways to help people, different techniques. And it's important that we not give up because we've experienced a technique, got frustrated, and thought, oh, this isn't going to help. For the individual who is out there who has experienced something that they felt was shocking, they felt was overwhelming, terrifying, or that kind of mortal punishment, you may be experiencing PTSD. So for you, it's important to know that there are methods out there that end PTSD symptoms altogether. People have done it, and people are teaching one another to do it. Don't always the medical model is great, but the medical model, it goes so far. And then there are these spiritual elements that are, also there that will help. But keep searching. If you're one of those individuals who've been looking for a technique, there are techniques out there. And I think it's important at this time to just offer the hope for those individuals.
Yeah. And I want to, just one other follow up question. What would you like people to remember this year? Every year, they always have a thing. What would you like to remember when you think about PTSD? When you think about people suffering, we're kind of out of COVID. We're kind of out of things. Things are not really ever going to be like the same as it was 2019. But,
Right.
what would you like people to remember, especially this year, as we remember things each month?
I don't know why this was coming up, but when Jesus said the poor will always be with us,
Hmm. Yeah.
it's like there'll always be trauma with us, right?
Yeah.
It's part of the journey that we have to move through, right?
Hmm.
So what I've discovered, as I mentioned earlier, is that each of us will have 3 significant moments that are rather challenging to us and are going to have these very triggering responses. Like we're always going to go back to them. Sometimes we can have, those memories come forward very shockingly. And so it's important to remember that's part of the journey. Now, the important thing also to remember is as soon as we experience one of those events, a pattern is established. And the only way that pattern is broken is when we have compassion for ourselves, when we forgive the other person and forgive ourselves. Immediately, it breaks that pattern. So the breaking of the pattern is the key. If we don't break that pattern for the first event, a second event comes and then a new pattern begins, a
Hmm.
new kind of testing begins. And it's important to, again, remember you have to break the pattern that's established there. The only way you do it is with forgiveness and compassion for self. And then if you don't do that second one or the first one, a third one comes. And this is when there's a major decision to be made. The chaos in that particular moment, it will make you make a choice. And the choice will be, I'm going to choose to live or I'm going to choose to die. And what I mean by that is that's when cancer develops, diabetes comes, a number of other different things happen because the body is in such a state of trauma, it no longer responds in a balanced way. So you need to know that if you carry the trauma with you, you're eventually choosing to have your system come out of balance and stay out of balance for a very long time. And that's what causes disease. So that's kind of what I would want us to remember. It's important to go back, look at it, release it so that our system doesn't come out of balance.
And I a lot of times think about a lot of these events, a lot of these situations. They take time.
Yeah.
But I think the interesting thing is we're talking about how we look at ourselves. If we value ourselves, value
Yeah.
our time, then the time doesn't really matter. A lot of times when we think about our lives, they're always, I say this sometimes, it sounds weird, but it's always unfinished. If you
Yes.
really think about it. And I find it like as cathartic as weird as it sounds, it's kind of freeing to know that whatever I do, it's always going to be constant. I joke with my clients, like life is not static, and they're like
Right.
they have this discussion. And I'm like, well, if it was static, then whatever team won the World Series would always won the World Series. And
Right.
they're like, no, 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 that's not true. And then I'm like, okay, so things do move along, whether good
Right.
or bad. And also, I think I do mention this author Viktor Frankl, but one thing I loved about him, that was inspiring about him, and paraphrasing is the people who did well are the ones who could control what they could control at the moment.
Yes. Yes.
Not about not the blind optimism,
Yes.
not the down pessimism. If the only thing you do today is just get up,
Yeah.
go outside and go for a walk, then
Yes.
do that. A
Yes.
lot of times we're on this. Sometimes trauma doesn't get picked up for a long time. It's
Yeah.
fairly new
Yeah.
in a concept. So if it's thinking that you've been struggling for 3 years,
Yeah.
when you value yourself, you're not gonna expect it to be a quick fix because it's gonna take time. Give yourself grace. Give
Yep.
yourself that time to figure it out.
Yep.
You're only on your own time, and having those conversations, those self-reflection conversations, will be helpful. Lastly, just any last final thoughts as we wrap up. I just want to say thank you so much for joining me, Dr. Joan
Thank you.
Samuels-Dennis. So,
I appreciate you having me here to talk about such an important topic. And in terms of final thoughts, my final thought is your journey is never over. So just keep moving, right? And the moment you have the thought, I am ready to heal, then a healing modality comes. You will discover it very quickly, but you have to be ready. And that's the beginning, really, of the journey.
yeah, and I just want to think about it this way. At least for me, we put the GPS to places we even know, which is kind
That's
of funny.
right.
I know sometimes in this, when you're dealing with your own struggles with mental health or trauma,
Yeah.
or sometimes it's not about just following the GPS. Sometimes it's about following what works.
Yeah.
And giving yourself, it's not going to be a seamless line, but along the way, I do encourage you that you'll learn a little about yourself, forgive yourself a little bit.
Absolutely.
So I just want to,
That's it. That's it. Self-discovery, right?
yes, and
Self-discovery is so important to the journey.
I just want to say thank you again for joining us. And also I want to stay updated with Revive Ministries through the various platforms, reviveministriesfl.com. This is goodbye for Revive Ministries, with leaving with its last quote. It's from Dealey. I don't know how to say that last name. Okay, thank you. Wounds won't heal the way you want them to. They'll heal the way they need to.
Love it.